And we're live. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Apologies for being slightly late there. Technical difficulties. We were just talking about how it's always something. And, Pascal Sheehy or Kay Burley or Megan Kelly or whoever, when they're reporting from studio or out, they don't do it themselves. They have producers for this reason because things always pop up. So, anyway, we're here now. Thanks everybody for coming along, joining the discussion. So, there's a lot I want to talk about tonight with Mr. Keith Woods. It's been a while since we've chatted. The last couple of times I think I've been on his channel, so this is a nice opportunity for me to direct the questions. So I suppose thanks for coming on.
Hey, always good to talk to you.
No bother. There's been 3 essays Keith's written in the last couple of weeks. Where are they? You can probably tell me if I can't find them here. Okay, so there's been Where the Children Play. It's about demographics, etc. We'll get into it, obviously. The End of Ireland's Great Consensus, which is the idea of the political consensus that's been in Ireland around immigration and diversity and multiculturalism and globalism for like the last 20 years. That's kind of finally cracked. And then the other one was What Do I Believe? And I kind of think the 3 of those essays are in different ways kind of related. What I Believe is very related to the demographic thing because your beliefs in general, it's like a 20-minute. I listened to it. I didn't read it. So it's like however long it is, it keeps touching back on that for obvious reasons. So those are kind of interrelated. And then when you look at Ireland, like what's going on in Ireland, how did the political census crack and all of that? It's totally related. The demographic issue, multiculturalism, immigration, the lack of, is it platonic ideals? I don't know. You can tell me about that, but that's actually, I like don't know anything about that, but that's why you're here. What I wanted to start with is the What I Believe essay. I know you wanted to write that for a while. You told me in real life, you kind of said it kind of in a sideways way. You mentioned that at some point you want to just write for once and for all what you believe just down to have it there. So I think that was the same idea you were having back then. And it starts with this kind of discussion of Plato and the good life. And we talked about that on a stream before. We touched on it. You edited out a clip about the good life. We had a good back and forth on that. I just want to get into it a bit more. If that's the foundation for what you go on to talk about, which is politics, global order, all of this kind of stuff, but you bring it back to like, what do you actually want? Like, why do you bother talking about politics or engage in this or spend your time on it? In essence, it always comes back to, unless it's just boredom, which I doubt it is, or keeping yourself entertained, what motivates you to do this stuff and to pursue the grander ideas of like global politics and all that in search of something, i.e. the good life. You said here, actually I'll get into the quotes in a minute, but in general, like, do you think about that a lot?
Yeah, first of all, I'm just going to plug keithwoods.pub, okay? Because I didn't realize they have a leaderboard on Substack, but I had a look today, and there's like 2 kind of dissident right people that are ahead of me in the leaderboard. So if I pass out those 2, and they're like very close to where I am, if I pass out those 2, I'll be like the biggest nationalist dissident right.
Name them. Just name them. Don't be
Academic Agent and Raw Egg Nationalist.
That's funny.
2 people I'm huge admirers of as well, which is quite funny.
And
that those are the 2 in the way.
And they're massive fans of you as well, of course. But
yeah, of course. But I've only been like posting since December, so I can, if I get a few more subs, I can pass them out pretty soon. So I'll be like
you'll beat 2 of them. You'll beat 2 of them. I saw you quoting. I don't get involved in e-drama. I know you don't either, but like, you do kind of cross swords with people. I don't at all. But you did post Raw Egg Nationalists prose. I thought that was quite something. Didn't you? Was it Raw Egg Nationalist or was it someone else?
Yeah. You broke up a little bit there, but yeah, I posted. He was writing an InfoWars article, and he had a long anecdote about when he was buying VHS tapes with his grandmother, and sometimes it's not like tactically good to make fun of people that have big audiences, but there's just a part of me that can't resist with a certain type of person. So I did take a shot. But he takes a lot of shot at Irish people as well, so I think that's justified. He's like an Anglo. But yeah, what was the question again? Anyway, everyone go subscribe.
No. If you're going to talk about like shilling the platforms and all of that, I forgot to do that, so I appreciate it. There are links in the chat below all my links on all of Keith's links, your bio link is there. So if Keith's link, one link follows on to all the rest, so you can support his channel, follow all of his stuff, and most importantly, follow his Substack so he can beat his enemies in the clout race to #1. But also, I have super chats back. I haven't had them in a while, so they're back now. So if you want a super chat, it's one of those streams as well where we were going to get into talking about stuff. So you know, it's not a formality for me to say that. You might actually have questions you want to ask, particularly of Keith. So they are there, and you can support the channel in other ways below mine. To my links, and you can also follow me on Rumble there as well in case I get banned here. So with that all said, what's the good life? What's your whole theory on, like, you know, some people want, like the trans liberals want, you know, everybody to be, they just want everybody to be transgender and diverse, and you know, they think that'll offer some sort of freedom. There's some, I don't know, probably some sort of, I'm using your vocabulary here, Gnostic theory and all of that behind it. And you talk about that kind of stuff. But what's your bedrock sort of ideal?
Yeah, well, I tried to lay out just a basic kind of political philosophy that I operate with, because that is a common question I get, like, what's your ideal form of government, or these kinds of theory cell questions. So I just put it all in one place. But yeah, I mean, my basic starting point, I mean, it's, you know, in many ways, you could say it's radical today, but it's not very radical in the grand scheme of things. I mean, what I'm laying out, I said I would endorse like a classical Republican form of government, ethno-nationalism. But I mean, these are all things that were basically taken for granted until quite recently. You know, Ireland is supposed to be a republic. You know, ethno-nationalism, political philosophers for all times basically just assumed that they were writing for a homogeneous population that shared language, culture, religion. You know, when these ancient philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, are writing about the republic or the city, they're talking about city-states that have like populations of a few thousand. You know, a town or a parish in today's vocabulary. But we've kind of forgotten these things, and we apply political theory very abstractly, and you know, we think that they describe democracy where they're talking about like 100 male property owners getting together to decide policy in the town square, and we think that applies to, you know, 100 million people voting in an election where they're getting their information from TikTok and Facebook. So it doesn't really apply. But yeah, I mean, my basic starting point is like how classical philosophy approaches this, which is to ask, what's the good life and what's the purpose of the state? And the purpose of the state is to inculcate virtue in people, to facilitate the good life. It gives us something that we wouldn't have if we just existed as individuals in some state of nature. You know, there's something natural about living in a collective. There's something natural about being part of a people. And an expression of that is having a state that can enforce the will of the people in ways that couldn't be done without a state. And that's my starting point is, you know, states, nations should represent collectives. It should represent ethnic groups. And those groups have interests. And also the individual has interests that is not necessarily immediately evident to them. If you're 14 and you think you should have, you know, life-changing chemical castration or some other kind of surgery, we can kind of rationally decide that that's not someone's good, right? But with our current kind of liberal paradigm, do what you want, right? The key to happiness is liberty, this very negative liberty where you just don't interfere with anyone. And that's very much not my approach to things. It's this more what people call like positive freedom, which is, you know, you're more free when you participate in a collective, when you embrace responsibilities, when you have some of these vices like drugs, other things that may lead people down a dark path, you know, that there's a proper place for the state to limit those things. So I'd say I have a kind of a classic Republican conception of government rather than a liberal conception of government. But what I'm defending in that article really is just a basic sort of ethno-nationalist position in terms of this is actually the most sensible way to organize the world, right? I mean, obviously nationalism is about your loyalty to your own group, your love for your own nation. What I'm laying out in that article is that really we've learned a lot of lessons in the 20th century, whether it's from science and the advances in genetic science or from history. And I think the great lesson of the 20th century, if you look at all the conflicts since the Second World War, It's ethnic conflicts, it's civil wars, it's things like the Troubles, it's ethno-religious conflicts, it's the fall of Yugoslavia, all these kinds of conflicts that are brought about by forced diversity, by bringing very different groups together, and eventually those groups seek some kind of self-determination. And if they have competing claims, it leads to violence and war and conflict. And I think there's a clear lesson to be gotten out of it that this project of forced diversity and now multiculturalism is destined to failure, and it's a very reasonable, fact-based, moral alternative that we as nationalists have. And
Okay,
that's kind of the basis of a lot of things that are right.
It's interesting just the way I'm going to glaze, I think is the vocabulary for it here a bit, a compliment, because it shows how, because I suppose you wrote these articles recently, so they're fresh in your mind, but to me, I've kind of dived into them for the last hour or two, more than I normally would, like particularly focusing on them, trying to pick out questions. And I asked you one question, but a lot of the questions that I have lined up, you've sort of touched on already ahead of time almost. Just because I suppose you've just rehearsed the article you wrote very well, so that's a good recall. But I kind of wanted to, like, you're naturally erring towards the grander point, let's say, of that What I Believe article. I kind of want to drag it back to, like I say, the good life platonic sort of bit you started on, because you're talking about, like, and you can elaborate on it because I don't have it good. Love and all of these kind of things. It sounds cheesy in a way because how that word is used these days, but you're sketching out sort of your ideals and what you think the good life is. You did mention there that, like, you kind of answered the question in a way that you don't want too much individual liberty for people because a 14-year-old will become a transgender or want to, and they don't have the right to do that. It's not good for them. And again, you touched on this as well, but I kind of want to hear a bit more about what you think are the positive things that a society in your ideal would do for an individual, as opposed to just keeping the nation together. How society should ideally exist for people throughout their lives, beyond just not becoming transgender or not, cutting something off yourself or whatever, in a positive sense. What matters, and what should a society exist to promote within its people so that an individual doesn't get totally lost, I suppose?
Well, the kind of classical answer to this would be, we're all seeking happiness, we're all seeking our good, and we are seeking freedom. And it's a question of what freedom is. And obviously that word conjures up a certain idea today, which is basically liberty. It's freedom from any kind of outside expectations or oppression or gender norms or any of these kind of social constructs. But there's a more classical idea of freedom, which is you're free to the sense that you're not constrained, and things like lust, greed, ignorance, these are things that constrain us. And so, if we want to free the individual, if we want to maximize the individual's potential, then we should be looking to inculcate virtue in them. Now, obviously, you can't micromanage every aspect of someone's life. You kind of have to give people the freedom to fail, right? I think Saint Augustine and Thomas Aquinas wanted to keep prostitution legal, actually, because they said, I think there's a quote from Augustine actually that if prostitution were made illegal, sodomy would become the norm, which I thought was kind of funny to read. But yeah, I don't believe in a totalitarian state. Some people necessarily will err. But I think if you're talking about, where people get meaning from, where they get what makes a virtuous person, I think a lot of it comes from relationships. And I think the state, the nation is an outgrowth of the family in many ways. And so I think a principal goal of the state should be to serve the family unit, to encourage family formation. Obviously, there's a necessity of survival there, just in terms of birth rates. But we have an understanding, or we did have an understanding of what the good life is, of what a virtuous person is, of how they attain that. And so I believe in a paternal state in certain regards, in terms of there are things that are just bad and lead to bad states for people. Total unguarded liberty is not necessarily a good thing. But yeah, I would say for the individual, the goal should be virtue, and there's also a collective sense there that we don't just exist for ourselves. We exist for our families, we exist for our extended folk. And so there has to be a sense of a national interest, national ideal, or national idea there as well. And people have to, learn a certain sense of civic virtue and nationalism that would, inculcate that kind of collective morality in people.
Interesting. There's it's just, and I only started thinking about this in the last 2 hours reading like that bit of that essay. There's a quote here. I'm not going to screen share because there's too much going on now already. But it's if I could just find it there. So this is just by the by. It's a tweet from Catholic Arena, who most of you will know. From how old is this? It's from 2015. So that just goes to show you how that's like and my maths is going bad on me. 9 years ago, right? So 9 years ago, and I still remember this tweet. I haven't seen it like since, but it jumped out to me when I was reading that. It's I'll just describe it. It's a picture of a statue of Jesus fallen with the cross, and it's a little girl of about 4 years old running over to try to pick up the cross and help him. So that's the picture. It's a nice, virtuous image. So this is from Catholic Arena. He said, it's a quote from, I can't even pronounce the name, some French philosopher, but it's happy the old people who after long experience and many trials reach superior simplicity of true wisdom, which they had glimpsed from a distance in their childhood. With this meaning, it can be said that a beautiful life is thought of youth realized in maturity. So it's kind of like you might be wondering where I'm going here. You thought you were going to just talk about politics or whatever, but it's kind of to me, that's one of the moral questions, or like the purpose of morality in a way, the purpose of virtue. Yeah, virtue is a better word. And a society sort of trying to guide some aspect of the good life for people. Because when you're young, you have this, you can call it a connection, closer connection to God. I'm not actually practicing religious. So you can take that as literal in a Catholic sense or some sort of generalized sense. But you are that way, and then you can sort of get distracted and lost throughout your life, and you figure everything out for yourself, and then hopefully through age and wisdom you sort of start to recover that. But you're old, so it's a different version of it. And to me, one of the purposes of society trying to protect virtue would be to sort of clean up that process a little bit. So to lower the amount of overall train wrecking there is in people's lives between the wisdom and the closeness to God of youth and the wisdom of old, that people don't go through an entire life sort of losing that, some sort of spiritual quality. I don't know what it is, but clearly those things correlate with not going to college and taking loads of drugs and not being, guided astray by excessive lust, which is human nature. So left without the management of society or some sort of direction, people will err towards almost animal nature. Hedonism, drugs, sex, nihilism, all of that. And that's always going to happen. People have to wonder a little bit and make their mistakes. But I just think, instead of people's lives being like 99% meaninglessness and error, trying to maximize that. So take someone like Plato, for example, right? I know nothing about him, but someone like him or someone like Thomas Jefferson, these historical figures who had tomes of wisdom, they didn't necessarily spend the majority of their life totally fucking up. They probably had a decent path, made their mistakes, but limited, so that they could build up this inheritance of wisdom throughout their own life. And then throughout generations, wisdom gets built up. It's a sort of a constructive thing over centuries as opposed to destructive. That's just kind of a general idea I had about it. But I want to read back a quote of yours, because one of the things I do sometimes is read your stuff, and there are parts of it I don't quite understand. So you quoted Plato and you said, the root cause of sin is excessive self-love. This should ring a bell for you, I hope. Excessive self-love, which is a disorder, an offense against the good, which is the very principle of generative generosity. but for that reason it is a loss of freedom. In short, Plato identifies unfreedom with opposition to the community that law creates. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Or
Yeah,
is it
that's a
not?
quote from a Catholic philosopher called D.C. Schindler, which was on this topic of contrasting like the classical idea of freedom with the modern idea of freedom. Because, like I said, when we say that word, it conjures a certain image. The point of Schindler's book is basically the modern idea of freedom is like a total inversion of what used to be understood as freedom, right? If freedom is um, kind of an ascension towards your good. Like it's not necessarily. I mean, when we think of freedom, we imagine like the open supermarket and basically endless like consumer choice. That's kind of how we see it. Or you can choose from hundreds of genders. It's just kind of open space, free creation. The classical idea of freedom is much more. We have a purpose. There's a teleology. There's an end to human action. There's a good for us that can be universalized. And so someone is free to the extent that they're participating in their good. They're part of the the creative act of the good. Because not to get too into metaphysics, right? But Plato's idea of the absolute, the ultimate, is this idea of the one or the good. And so reality is this kind of generative creative process. And so insofar as you're in alignment with your own teleology, you're in alignment with broader creation, the good itself. So yeah, the purpose of the quote basically is this liberal idea of freedom, of like self-focus, self-care, kind of this narcissistic idea. That's really a limitation on freedom. You really ascend to higher levels of human consciousness, freedom, understanding, as you embrace responsibilities, as you find meaning. I think when people talk about the sense of freedom, it's very much tied up with meaning, and meaning is always, it always has a social aspect, right? We like I said in that article, like you can talk about encouraging love and selflessness in people, but ultimately people find those virtues through their particular relationships. You can think of the typical leftist that, radical leftists, if you look at the research, they're very narcissistic, they're very high in psychopathy. And they very much do promote this ideal of kind of universal love. I don't see race, I don't see ethnicity or nationalism. We're thinking in this broad universal way. But that's a totally alien way of looking at humanity, right? I mean, who would save someone else's child before their own child, right? And we don't see anything perverse about the love parents have for their children. We recognize that there's something good in that, because you're obviously capable of far more affinity and compassion for people that are genetically related to you. So this is kind of a deep error in the leftist or liberal way of looking at things, is that you're kind of virtuous insofar as you've cast off those natural affinities, because there seems to be, to the leftist mind, there seems to be something kind of unfair about that, right? Why would you privilege one person over anyone else, right? The ideal is universal love. But like I said, it's a very much kind of an abstract idea of love. It's like an alien's way of looking at things. And we find virtue and we find the better part of ourselves in our particular relationships, which bring
That's
responsibilities
interesting.
with them.
Just to just on that, one of the thoughts I had recently was that kind of universal love thing. This is a bit more red meat for the audience kind of thing, getting back to the usual kind of tweet level of stuff. Is universal love for everybody. Like, so I might not have love for like to me the like a form of love. I had I'll just give you an anecdote. I remember saying to someone close to me who works with like special needs people or whatever, right? They're working in that, and I was a bit younger, a bit more naive, maybe a bit more hedonistic and disconnected from, I don't know, the good. And I said, "Oh man, that job's really tough going. You have to change their nappies, and some of them are like half adults and stuff. That's I couldn't do that." And I remember she said to me, "What are you going to do? Just leave them there?" And I thought, "Oh yeah," like I felt terrible. I was thinking, oh yeah, like if everyone had the thought that I just had, my instinct there, it would be, well, you're going to just leave vulnerable, weaker people who should be cared for, to die because I'm like a 24-year-old like idiot, basically. And to me, that's true love, is people caring for their, not exclusively so, but caring for someone close to them, their kin especially, who is vulnerable, and doing it despite losing out on the freedom and the joys of going clubbing, whatever else, like having this free kaleidoscope of a life, sacrificing certain personal pleasures for charity and greater good. And it's not the love of, I love everybody in the world equally and I love transgenders. For example, like, you don't, for all the talk about diversity, there is very little mixing. You've kind of frozen there on me, Keith. I don't know, are you just very still or have you roboted out? But we'll see in a minute. But this idea that, like, of diversity, one thing I noticed recently is that besides for when people are paid to be together, these groups that are forced together in Ireland, I've lost Keith. We'll see if he jumps back in. I'm going to ramble on this. He has the link, so he can jump back in. He'll let me know. Besides the for all the talk about like these NGO functions where Roma gypsies, travelers, Jews, Muslims, and black people, all these people get together for like the glories of diversity. Last Gale says Keith was lost in thought. Yeah, that'd be extreme. But for all of that, I started thinking, these people who are completely at odds with each other, like, imagine putting a Muslim, a Jew, a traveler, a black person, and a transgender in a room and thinking that's some sort of natural social situation. That's obviously like ridiculous, right? You couldn't, like, if you put them in a room, you'd come back and find like, chunks of flesh left behind, because there's such natural disharmony in multiple directions between those groups. And it got me thinking that sort of graphic design level of diversity and apparently love, because we're talking about love and all of that, you will only find when Keith says Wi-Fi crashed. I don't, maybe he just got bored of me or something. I don't know. Well, do we believe him? Do we not? Let's see. Well, whether it's an excuse, Keith, maybe I took you in the wrong direction, I'll believe you. But you can always try to jump back in if you want to. I mean, I can sort of ramble, but most of my stuff is designed at you, prepared to ask you questions. But so anyway, try to jump back in if you can. DM me. I'll finish the current thought I'm on while I'm at it. So, outside of an NGO get together in Dublin somewhere, where all these groups or supposed representatives of these groups get together to have a conference, they're all paid by the government. So that's one thing. Outside of that, you think, what other scenario could you expect to see people like that or at least some of those groups together in a room for long periods of time? It would be work. It would be McDonald's. You might have all different types of transgender, a Muslim, a black person, or Irish person, whatever. It's when they're at work, that they're being paid. That's usually when this happens. So it just goes to show you that this whole idea of love, like everybody's going to get along, we if that were the case, it would be happening in Ireland now because we have so many people of different backgrounds. But if anyone were being honest, they would look at it and say, yeah, besides NGOs and besides McDonald's or work or wherever it is, you just don't see it. So, the idea of like transmuting the concept of love and the good from looking after a vulnerable family member when it's not exactly ideal for your own self-fulfillment and your own maximization of your pleasure, that's kind of true love, loyalty, all of these things. The idea that is de-emphasized in the current culture, and some sort of ridiculous abstract sort of globalist concepts, these things that are like upon investigation are completely preposterous. It's a sad society where we emphasize the wrong and we de-emphasize the right, I suppose. I'm just seeing if Keith's Wi-Fi will come back or whatever, or whether he'll find the will to keep talking to me. I don't know. I mean, other than that, I don't know, lads. But just bear with me because I'm basically in flux here because I'm either waiting for Keith to pop back in, or I'm trying to rapidly come up with something to talk about, I suppose, in the meantime. I think all else failing, I can either pull up videos from Twitter as I do, or I can read you what I was going to ask Keith, which would be weird, but I could do that as well. So I don't know. There he is. He says he'll try to rejoin. Great. Okay, well, that's good to know. At least I have somewhere where I'm going. Maybe I could just go through my questions. I wrote them on this A4 pad, completely the wrong way around. So it's just a big mess, as usual with me. So that was the discussion about love and all of that. I kind of wanted to just drill down on that a bit because, like, while I'm waiting for Keith to come back in, there is a tendency in a lot of live streams that I see for them to sort of go off in this a lot. And it could be some I'm involved in, other ones. I'm talking about live streams where like two people speaking in this kind of milieu where they just say like, you know, oh, diversity is crazy bad. You know, it's crazy the government are bringing these people in, but it doesn't really work, and you know, that kind of stuff. And it's like, yeah, that's grand, we all know it, and it bears repeating. And like, you name it, just think of the standard thing. You go scroll on Twitter for a few hours in these circles that you're reading, and people just hash that back and forth among each other. And I just think, and I will get into some of that stuff, of course, but I just, there's only a certain amount of that I can listen to. I can listen to daily news. I think that's good. That's kind of what I do. But if you're trying to discuss concepts and ideas, have a discussion about concepts and ideas to some extent, then to just hash out effectively, I don't know, made for viral tweets back and forth in the form of speech on a live stream, to me, that's and especially, you know, to someone of Keith's intellect, and I'm not the most dumb person ever either, I suppose. So it's gonna, like, maybe try to do a little bit more, you know, try and get into something a little bit new, a little bit novel. Why not? That's just because if you're, as a listener, going to tune in and think, okay, I like Garrod Murphy, I watch his streams, I love Keith Woods, he's this thing or whatever. Oh, let's hear the two of them talk. Am I going to come on and just say, oh, look, it's 200,000 immigrants this year? That isn't that crazy? Like, you know, where's it all going? And you know, it's just not good enough, I think. I hope the rest of my stream is good if Keith does come back now, because I've talked it up a bit, like it's the most original thing ever. So yeah, look, yeah, my super chats are back. That's good. You feel free. I'm going to shill, because people tell me that to shill that stuff, because nobody's going to go out of their way if you don't mention it. And I've spent years making content, doing stuff, never doing that and feeling like obtuse about it. But I was talking to someone about this earlier today, that it is actually important. That there's no pressure on anyone here for me. I just mean in general. I've always said, whether it's Phil or Keith or someone, that so let's take Phil, for example, right? The better Phil does out of what he does, the better it sort of is for everyone. And it might sound convenient for me to say that now, as I'm mentioning super chats, but regardless, it is just one of those things that, like, if Phil goes out to do his big stream and he gets 10,000 views and everyone loves it and he's produced a great thing, he's created something, he's had a huge audience and all that. If he has to go back home and figure his life out entirely after that, and everyone can see that he doesn't make nothing of it, it's just a sort of martyrdom. I don't know, there's something just structurally weak about that, where it's like, well, that doesn't kind of make sense. Whereas if and I don't know other people's situations, but you know, if they're doing well for themselves, then that looks good. I don't know, it just looks, it is good for them, and it looks good for everybody else. So it's just, that's my long-winded shill. Anyway, it's back.
Hello.
I
don't know what happened there. My Wi-Fi just disappeared. That's actually never happened to me before. I don't know if it's quite windy here.
Are you trying to say that I'm windy? Like my questions are windy, or
no? That's like I've been here for a while now, and that's the first time the internet has ever just disappeared. So I don't know, but I have my phone on data as backup now, so we should be good.
Okay, must add it again. Oh, you're gone again a little bit.
Yeah.
Oh wait, you're there. Okay, hang on. So basically, I just shilled. I tried to shill my super chats, and I ended up talking about.
Just let me know, and I'll connect to my data.
Okay, I will. Yeah, I was shilling again and tried to make a big like story about why it's good to support creators. I mean, it might have sounded a bit self-interested, but I mean, we could go off on that, but I think you'd probably agree that people being supported in general, as opposed to like meant to be these people who are just consistently delivering stuff as a martyr or whatever. It is better for people to be supported. But anyway, that sounds self-interested, so I'll stop talking about it. But I was asking you.
Arrow super chats, so
Yeah, you just hit up the super chats, lads. That's all. The long story short,
he's
just
been
do
putting
that.
the work in. I mean, I've been watching your streams the last few nights, and it's like 4 or 5 streams, and you go offline with no super chats. So there's definitely a backlog now that you have them back.
That's my point exactly. Yeah, I don't. One of the things that it's kind of hard to pick up where we left off, but this just kind of is on my mind since I read your thing, and it's sort of something I think about once in a while. So, like, I'll give a weird example here. There was some viral YouTube shorts or TikTok dance thing or something that I just scrolled past at one point online, and it was, the dance was based on a song, and the song was in the title below, and I looked up the song, and it was this Troye Sivan, famous kind of gay, wafy looking singer or dancer person, and I was watching the music video, and he's sort of dancing around the place in like Thailand, and he's basically being very gay, very in a strange environment, very free, and it's jumping around the place. And I remember thinking to myself, maybe a 13-year-old girl would watch that and sort of relate to it, the gay kind of girl connection. And the video is just this kind of, it's called Got Me Started, right? And it's just sort of, it's almost like a anthem of the hedonistic modern, the one you were describing a while ago, version of freedom, this kind of completely hedonism, freedom from any responsibility version of that, or a version of freedom. And I was looking at it going, I can see how this would be alluring to young people in a way, especially the ones who think that like being gay is the highest virtue and the highest form of sophistication and liberty. And it got me, since I saw that, I remember thinking a lot of conservatives, nationalists, and all that would watch that and go, look at that guy prancing around the place. That's nonsense. And this could be true for, like, I don't know, Nicki Minaj or any kind of pop thing, that a conservative mindset is to dismiss it. But there's more to be said for looking at it and thinking, well, there is a sell here. They are selling something. They're selling the idea that you are leading this life where you are totally you're successful, you're talented, you're buzzing, you're in this thing, and nobody's telling you anything. Nobody's telling you what you can and can't do, or who you shouldn't be loyal to. You're just this free agent. And I often think like there needs to sort of be a response to that. So you can talk, and this isn't like a criticism of you, but you can talk about like the good life, you can talk about Catholicism, you can talk about Platonic ideals, but there is this kind of tension there where it's like, as populism and nationalism and all this rises, and it does, there's Andrew Tate and there's Fuentes and there's this and that, these kind of various strands that are like making it cool in a way. But there does need to be this kind of like argument made somehow with effectively pop music, everything from Madonna to Troye Sivan now, which embodies something a lot more than just a flashy music video. Why there is more, because immediately it sounds stodgy and it sounds boring or something. Why there is more joy and more fulfillment to be found in depth of virtue than there is in whatever it is this globalist ideal is offering. I don't think that's something conservatives and nationalists kind of take seriously. I don't know if you have anything really to say to that, but
no, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's difficult because people talk about like, oh, conservatives need to make their own art, they need to make their own culture. But the problem is when they try, it's always crap. Like, I don't know if you saw the Daily Wire. They're doing like an animated sitcom, like a Family Guy type thing, and it's like they post clips to Twitter, and it's like every single joke is the same, which is basically, oh look, it's like an SJW libtard, and he's being really ridiculous. He's saying not to misgender people, and he's saying not to use the word manager because it has the word man in it. And it's like that's every single clip from the show. Like there's no actual like humor or satire other than like conservatives kind of getting together scoffing at how silly liberals are. But yeah, it's like there is something. I mean, there is something deeply, like art is kind of, at least modern art, like there's something kind of necessarily left wing about it, in that like you're kind of leaning into like the, I mean, if you want to use the word like Dionysian, or, but it's novel, it's new, it's deconstructing what's there. Um, like that whole wave of kind of 60s rock music and stuff, like you can see the appeal. And it's hard to put up a cultural force that's kind of conservative or in favor of order. But that's why I think as the left becomes like totally hegemonic, um, I think you will see more of a kind of revolutionary energy in the other direction. And that's kind of a positive thing almost about like just how totally dominant the left is culturally now, is nothing really has rebellious energy on the left anymore, or anything coming out of the mainstream. Like it is very preachy. It is very, reading out the rules to everyone. And so as nationalism, or as dissident right or whatever becomes something that's a much more like disruptive force in terms of like, no, we won't join your military, we think your culture is gay, we won't partake in these collective things. I think that does give it a kind of rebellious energy, which is why you do see a lot of zoomers, males gravitating towards the red pill stuff or the Fuentes type stuff, because there's something there. Like there's something there that isn't just handed down by your teachers, and by the media, the elite class. But yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's hard consciously to craft any of these things. Like I said, anytime conservatives are like, let's make some conservative art, it's like, oh boy, like this is gonna be rough.
Jimmy Carr,
But
anti-woke kind of stuff. Yeah.
yeah,
But like
yeah,
I agree with you. Like even something like saying, like, just to quote you back to yourself, that your culture is gay. Like that's funny. Like straight away that puts a smirk on my face because it's funny. It's just funny to say, like, to just say that's gay is hilarious now, because it's such a like breach of the orthodoxy. I saw today, this was just related but funny, that Phil Dwyer was streaming from Clon. I've forgotten the name of it, literally, some place in Dublin.
no,
No,
oh no,
it
no, the
was
one in
no,
Dublin.
no, it was Ballyogan in Dublin.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
I think I saw
he
this clip.
said, it was so funny because he said, there was a woman and a man guard there, and he's kind of chastising them, and he says, what do you say? What do you have to say for yourself, Bangarda? And the other guard jumps in and says, "She's a guard. She's not a vanguard. She's not a vanguard." Or she said, "Yeah, she's not a vanguard." And I thought that's so funny, like how they react to the vanguard thing. For anyone who's not Irish, vanguard just means woman guard, which up until a couple of decades ago was the official designation for a female police officer, was vanguard woman. She's not a guard, she's a woman guard. Which, just by the by, I find I think one of the most hilarious things, like abuses of liberal orthodoxy now, is to use what was the cutting edge of liberalism like 20 years ago, and I think it would grind them more than if you were the most reactionary person ever. So if you just say something like vanguard about, so that offends them more than saying women shouldn't have the right to vote. I think vanguard is more offensive because it's closer to the nerve. And if you, instead of using like slurs for gay people or something, if you just say, I'm totally against homophobia, I'm not for it, whatever two men do in the privacy of their own home, so just so long as they keep it in the privacy of their own home, none of my business. That would totally grind the gears of a liberal now, because obviously it's not meant to be, it's meant to be in school now, not the home. But so if you want to offend liberals, just use 20 years ago progressivism. But anyway, so yeah, I don't want to keep you too long because we're only getting started, and whenever you want, you can just pull the plug. But or your Wi-Fi can go again. Your Wi-Fi can just cut out at some point. Don't worry about it. But
I have the data as backup now. I'm not going anywhere.
okay. But do let me know. But just related to that, the Bambi Thug thing, right? That was a big cultural issue in Ireland. This extreme satanic transgender Eurovision thing. I'm going to go on record and be controversial here and say I didn't think it was entirely without merit, as in it could have been cool if it were a bit different. People tried to say, oh, this is just derivative But you know, the fact that at least she was trying to appeal to something different, the idea of putting metal and ballet in there and having this whole scene. It's just referring to what I did before, and I'll get away from it then. You know, the idea of like European Swedish death metal, like, you know, something like that, and mixing it with ballet and being offensive in some way. It would have been much better if she had, like, I don't know, some other imagery, like some sort of pagan imagery and stuff like that, close to the edge or whatever. That would have been cooler. And this sort of energy would have been cool, better than Donna and Joseph McCall, better than Mickey Jo Hart, arguably. And I just thought, like, yeah, it's silly that she's doing the trans thing, and the whole thing is kind of silly in a way, and it is appealing to the orthodoxy of the current time. But, you know, I thought there was kind of something to it, and at least it was. I would take it over the like bog basic kind of stuff. I don't know. I'll leave it. I don't expect you to reply to that, but there's just
It's
there's
gonna
something.
be a controversial take. Yeah,
It is,
I
yeah,
never
no.
actually saw the performance of the song, so I can't even comment.
Well, like I like take most nationalist right wingers and stuff. I agree with the general sentiment. It is totally ridiculous and whatever. But sort of, you know, it's this thing of like she does the satanic kind of thing, and people go, "Oh no, Satan's coming back." You know, this is bad. There's something a bit like, well, that's not what there is to really criticize about. I don't think she's actually summoning up the devil. Let's be real. But I don't know. There's what I'm saying is there's a kernel of excitement within that. Something about the transgressive and all of that that does attract people, especially young people in. And I suppose I don't have a question to ask you because you've already answered it. Basically, being a right wing shitposter or whatever is more transgressive now anyway. So that's kind of that question answered. I know I've put myself on the hook for Bambi Tug and Andrew Tate, which I've seen
Yeah.
the whole chat is like given out to me about. I'm not saying I like these people like without qualification. Just everything is nuanced. Get over it. But so okay, so I want to move on now. I'll move on because I want you to talk, not me. Just onto the political side of your what I believe essay, beyond like love and Plato and everything else. So I'll just read you what I've written here. It's quicker. I say, on one hand, you grant the internationalism, or you grant that internationalism, market interconnectedness, and global military hegemony has an ability to reduce conflict. But those same systems drink. So, okay, I can speak to it. You grant that all of these things I mentioned, globalism basically, has in some senses reduced conflict since maybe World War II. But then on the other hand, you go on to argue that these systems, I'm sort of summarizing, I hope correctly, that these systems end up drinking their own Kool-Aid, ignoring human nature, ignoring the power of ethnicity and identity. And so that in itself ends up creating or allowing conflict, provoking conflict in a sense. But it just gets me thinking about that whole question of like, so if we have global American military hegemony, let's say, we have globally enforced equality, we have interconnected markets and the reduction of identity or the emphasizing of it, and that on one hand maybe reduces conflict.
You just got muted there.
That was just a slip of my thumb. But basically, it's kind of like you're sort of hinting at the idea that, it goes one way, yes, you'll grant it. And then on another side, it has a negative effect. And it just gets me thinking about someone like Anthony Bourdain. I'm sure you've seen it, that clip where he's in a German restaurant talking about how the only way we're going to have peace in this world is to mix everyone into cappuccino colored people and get over this idea of like antiquated identities. And again, to give Bambi Thug her due, it's kind of like, well, if you're taking that argument on face value, there may be something to it. Like, let's just be completely generous. If everyone were just cappuccino colored, hypothetically, maybe there would be less identitarian fervor and it would reduce war. But then on the other hand, you're saying that, well, by ignoring these things, it's sort of unnatural and it provokes war. What would you say to Anthony Bourdain or Peter Sutherland?
Yeah, I mean, just to qualify that, like, yeah, I do There I've seen takes from reactionaries that, well, actually everything is like the worst it's ever been, and I've seen people defend that like medieval peasants were like wealthier than the average middle class person now. And I'm like, yeah, I don't really I don't really buy that. Or I've even seen people argue that like slaves in the American South were like better off than like modern day wage laborers, and I'm like, yeah, I just don't really buy that on a number of levels. But yeah, I mean, the kind of Steven Pinker, like the liberal optimist, like, oh, we have fewer wars now than ever. That is true. Like, if you look at like between states conflicts, there's very few. You can almost name all the ones from the last like 20, 30 years. Whereas there was a time where you had dozens of these every year, right? And there's all sorts of other trends that have gone down in terms of violence. And that's really the purpose of liberalism is to reduce conflict, to eliminate group conflict, to kind of deracinate, atomize people out of their group identities, to have a world of peace and harmony. And obviously that had quite particularist beginnings, right? Originally it was about these religious wars in Europe and trying to take religion out of the states so Protestants and Catholics could coexist. But now, yeah, it's the John Lennon imagined view of things, that if we could only just put all our identities aside and, like you said, become this kind of this mixed race mass, then none of these identities will matter. I mean, the problem is it's a fantasy. It's not going to happen. You're not going to forcibly mix the entire world into one race, and it just ignores there's some people go too far with the sociobiology stuff, but there is like a basic insight from what we know about genetics, which is, and I mean, this doesn't even need to be justified scientifically. I mean, we know with our own family or own relatives that you feel more, you care more, you relate more to people that are genetically similar to you. And so, if you want to function in society, the ideal society would be, a big family. Like a very well functioning society is the family, like, because you have a deep care and affinity and understanding of people in your immediate family. And like in an ideal world, right, the whole state would be like that, the whole nation would be like that. We don't live in that kind of world, but we have ethnic groups that are they're kin selected, they're biologically selected. This is something that you see across animal species, that they tend to cohere into groups, and this has advantages. That's why they exist, is because it was more advantageous than an individualistic strategy to have this group cohesion. But that's just a fact that exists. There's a book I quoted in that article called Tribe, that by Sebastian Junger. It's actually really good. I'd recommend it. I think the guy that wrote it is probably like a bit of a leftist, in that he avoids like the kind of conclusions about ethnicity and race that are in his book, but it's still really interesting in terms of him talking about the deep meaning people get in times of group conflict. And he talks about, like, in France, when it was invaded by Germany, the mental asylums emptied, suicide disappeared for a couple of years. Same thing in London during the Blitz. People talk about that a lot, the spirit of the Blitz. But even in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, like, you could trace the areas with the most conflict had a collapse in suicide, and the areas with least conflict had the most suicide, especially in men. So like there is something very deeply embedded in us, that we have this need for belonging to a wider community. We have this deep need for a connection with kin. And as I'm rambling here, I've kind of forgot what the question was.
Well,
You asked me
I'll jump in. I'll jump in because I'm not trying to turn this into some sort of debate where I like try to like pick on, like, pull little threads out of your
Mhm.
thesis. I'm not trying to do that, but at the same time, I don't want to be boring. I think it's more fun to sort of jump into like Peter Sutherland's skin, his like former skin,
Sure.
and try to like provoke responses. So like something Anthony Bourdain might say to you is, okay, so Keith Woods, very interesting, but so you're trying to tell me that we would be at the most heightened state of togetherness and unified joy if we were just constantly at war with someone else, right? That would be the obvious retort to that. Now, I know you're just using that to make a point about human togetherness, but what would you, let's say to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can obviously inculcate that sense without necessarily having to be in war. Generally, times of hardship tend to create that, or times that just force people to bond collectively, that force people to work together, that gives people a sense of a collective identity, or like a spirit of teamwork. But as far as like if a liberal is to argue, well, that's going to create conflict. Well, I mean, the problem is, you can just point to liberal societies and the kind of enclavism that happens in multiculturalism. Do people really go to the UK and forget about their race, and everyone just intermarries? No, there's obviously racial, ethnic ghettos. Muslims create their own communities. They still have their own kinds of leadership. Ethnic resentment is created. I don't think anyone thinks that, like, literally, the whole world is going to like mix into one mass. So what you get in like liberal multicultural societies isn't like individualist colorblind society, or it isn't even multiculturalism. It's a plurality of cultures. There's a little bit of mixing on the outskirts in terms of, yes, liberals of all races are mixing. But generally, you just get every group is more isolated, every group is more alienated. There's like masses of studies on this. I linked them in that article. But a Danish university did like a study 4 or 5 years ago, and it was like a survey of all the studies in sociology ever done on social trust, which is super important for sociology, right? The degree to which you trust your neighbors, you feel safe walking outside your house. Just like really the core of a functioning society is social trust, right? It's having a sense of, these are my people, we can get stuff done together. And in all of these studies, diversity like markedly lowered social trust. So the more diverse your society, the less social trust there is. And the famous study done on this, Bowling Alone, he was actually like a liberal sociologist, Robert Putnam. But he studied the effects of this, and he said it led to huddling, is what he called it. That number of negative effects, but people give to charity less, they take part in their community less, they're more likely to think people lie to them, they watch more television, just all the kinds of things that don't really lead to a functioning society. But he called it huddling, that they kind of go into their shell, they lock into their house, into their room, and they just kind of shut off from the rest of society. It doesn't necessarily turn into ethnic tension or conflict where they want to go out and battle all these different people, but it just makes people more insular, more alienated. So the data is kind of out. Like it's kind of settled science, if you want to look at it from that social science perspective. That you can have John Lennon's Imagine world in theory, but in practice, it makes everyone more all the things leftists would not want for a society, right? It makes everyone more individualist, more alienated, more selfish, and it creates conflict.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's like a good answer. I think as well, like, you're quoting social studies and Putnam and all that, but I mean, obviously, and it's good to quote studies, but the other aspect is the intuitive reality that we just see and feel in our daily lives. You don't, it's almost like some of this stuff doesn't, we're talking about it and thinking about it now, but someone can just like live their life and just experience it without having a rhetorical suite of answers about this. They just see it. And that's really
I mean,
best.
that's why that's why that bell curve meme is real on a number of different topics, where like the low IQ people and like a subsection of high IQ people agree on something, and it's like the people in the middle that are very much with the regime. Because it's like, yeah, I mean, this stuff, it is almost banal to have to argue for to explain it. I mean, obviously, in the context of like going up against all the kind of liberal leftist narratives that exist to deconstruct this stuff, you haven't countered them. But at the same time, you're defending stuff that is like very basic and intuitive and has been, the foundation of human social order for thousands of years. So yeah, like that's why, like I said, the bell curve meme. You have to have a certain level of intelligence to just learn this bullshit that they use to justify the liberal order, and just to be able to repeat it back to people. But
Yeah.
past a certain level, you can see how ridiculous it is, and below a certain level of intelligence, like it's just too obvious and intuitive to believe the kind of academic deconstructions about this stuff.
I think the middle of the bell curve are probably most attuned to the hegemonic power in control, so they're smart enough to realize what they have to do to just play ball and survive individually or their close kin or family, which is fair enough.
Yeah.
But not smart enough to be sort of stubborn and
Yeah.
and that. So to kind of like insist on analyzing it. But as to I'll just add to what you said, like the question of war, like would everyone just be at war in order to feel tribalistic and happy? The same you could say for the argument of like when poverty comes in the door and nationalism rises, they could say, oh, well, that's a sign of an ugly thing. When poverty comes in, people start pointing the finger and blaming their enemies or something like that. But you could argue it both ways, but more likely it's just that when you're less distracted by gadgets and material prosperity, you resort and you retreat to what matters, and connect more to whether it be your family, your nation. That's just another example. Actually, is just take. I've had 2 kids in the last few years, and I've noticed not necessarily me, but other people. What I've seen is that when people are in their 20s, they're happy to live their own life as an individual away somewhere else. And then they have kids and they want to move back to near where their parents are, and they want to be near their family, and they understand it again because they're under pressure. So I think it's a sufficient answer, whether it's war, family rearing, economic decline, or whatever, that you could argue the case that just because those things are tough in a way, it doesn't mean that they're directly correlated. But so I'll just go on to my next sort of question here, just going through the list. So this is just quoting you. It's from the same essay. Far from stripping away national identity, globalization and communications technology has spread the powerful idea of national sovereignty, while the realization of a world of other nations has everywhere been a catalyst for people identifying with and politicizing their own ethnic identity. So it's kind of this idea that, like, far from ethnic identity being this thing of the past, a outgrowth of ignorance, it's actually quite the opposite. The more informed, and you referred to like centuries ago when the original sort of insurgency of nationalism a few hundred years ago might have been to do with the printed word. And it could be the same with the internet. So again, it's not a regression to some past ignorance. It's actually an opening up of understanding. And it just makes me think about this. And you can give me the vocabulary for this, whether it's techno-feudalism or techno-utopianism. I don't know. I was streaming recently. I was talking about like how these Kaleisen brothers and these kind of people are trying to like come up with ideas to shift the staid politicians of the past who can't sort out housing, they can't sort out this. If us tech bros just got together, we could come up with blueprints, schematics, and CAD drawings to just get things done very efficiently, the way a tech company is run, get it all out there. And I kind of joked to say, oh, there would be like phone charging sockets, coming out of bushes or whatever. We'd have the most, it'd be like Singapore times 10. And it just makes me think of how lacking, and this is where someone like you comes in, because you're at the fore of these things, like intellectually, you're like an intellectual voice, like speaking at the high level. Those people who are like, they're not necessarily the left, crazy lefties, but they are sort of like a counterpart of someone like you, who are trying to talk about a modern, radical, futuristic view of society solving problems. And yet the issue I have with them all the time is that they refuse to engage in discussions of gender, race, ethnicity, human nature, all of that. And I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about that, the lacking of that in their narrative.
Yeah, I mean, on that topic, like the origin of nationalism and stuff, like I think I've made 4 or 5 videos on that. That's a topic that interested me a lot, because on that topic, I mean, what you were saying earlier of, like the stuff that's so intuitive that you don't even need a justification. It's like I studied philosophy and sociology in university, and like that's a lot of my experience is like when you go into like leftist university departments, that you encounter all these narratives. Like they say, well, actually, like nationalism was invented in like the 1880s by capitalists, and like prior to that, no one ever had a sense of national identity, like racism was just invented in the 19th century by the Brits to to justify their empire, to create capitalism. And it's like, it's like really, like on a deep level, sounds like complete nonsense. But there's like a mass of academic bullshit that's been built up around that. So that's kind of something that's interested me the last few years. Is like how can like the whole intellectual department get the question of nationalism so wrong in terms of like the origin of it, what it means to people, why it matters to people. And there's actually some interesting stuff about that. But yeah, as you look at it, you realize that a big part of it was just the empowering of the masses. Like they'll leftists will use this narrative that like, well, as you got more urban societies, you got like a concentration of elites, you got the emergence of a capitalist elite, and then they created this mass culture, and they had to have a common language, they had to have a common culture to express the language in, to create industrial society. So they like invented nationalism. And that's kind of the popular like modernist academic understanding of nationalism. But actually what was happening is that if you look at like where national cultures were emerging from, it was from the countryside, it was from the peasantry. And so actually it was just the fact that these people were able to vote now, they were able to write, they were able to express themselves now, and were moving to the cities. And so you didn't have culture creation by, just a very kind of centralized aristocratic elite that tended to be less nationally conscious. But like that kind of basic understanding has actually led to so much conflict in the 20th century. This is the thing, it's like we're obviously accused of creating some kind of environment of conflict or violence. But it's like that basic kind of misunderstanding that ethnic identity is primordial and is not going away, and is probably just going to increase with globalization. That's led to so much conflict, civil war, ethnic conflicts, genocide, like in terms of the attempts at state building in Africa and the Middle East and so on. And it's kind of crazy to think like the amount of kind of destruction and carnage that is caused by like a basic kind of sociological error that's rooted in like the leftist understanding of the world. But yeah, I mean, see, again, I've gone a ramble and kind of forgot the premise.
I can bring you back if you want. I can
yeah,
jump
sure.
in.
It was about the vision of like the techno utopians, right?
Well, I know I can jump in. I can jump in. So like just one of the just to add to some of your points there, that like the idea of everyone abandoning identity, one of the key points, just we've spoken about that here and there, is that like the mutually assured destruction of nuclear war or whatever, that idea, that general concept, game theory concept. And the problem with this like abandonment of identity, global identity, like just globally, the problem with that obviously is that, well, yeah, okay, maybe in the West we would do that, for better or for worse, we can argue that all day, but they're not doing that in India, a billion plus 1.5 billion people nearly. They're not doing that in China, 1.5 billion people. What are we, nearly up at half the world's population? Let me include Indonesia, let me include Myanmar, go on and on and on. So suddenly it's the majority of the world's population are completely not engaging in this. So whatever way this experiment pans out, it's not like the entire 8 billion people of the world just all jumped in and we'll see how it goes. It's just us in the West. So that's just one key point. But and just like as regards my sort of question, it wasn't really a good question, to be honest. So not your fault, about the techno feudalism and these kind of tech heads who were talking about like practical solutions to problems without addressing the elephant in the room of like human beings. The thing, I'll kind of just like cut that question in a way, because what I really want to say is that like you're speaking at the high level, doing your thing, as are others. And I suppose just over time, hopefully it bleeds over. That's all you can hope for. That the high level of discussion.
It's pure ideology with those guys. It is incredible. Like Daniel Dennett was like he died this year. I think he just died like a month ago. But he's one of the new atheists. But he was like the flagship guy of like rationality, science, the empirical method, throw away all these spooks of religion and mysticism. I mean, he went so far in it that he wanted to throw away consciousness, right? That was his thing, is like reducing consciousness to matter. But he said before that if scientific evidence came out that said there were intelligence differences between races, that he would like advocate for suppressing that information and like punishing anyone that put it out there. I mean, you encounter this all the time. I saw some people were arguing in my replies recently, and there was like a kind of like a normie liberal was in there, right? He had the Premier League avatar, and he was all posting about football. But like someone started probing him. It was kind of funny, and he gave like the basic kind of understanding of like Darwinian evolution. And the guy was like, "Well, do you think it just stopped applying to humans like 10,000 years ago?" And the guy just said, "Yes." It's like,
Huh.
it's like,
But it's
I
but
don't
it's like, yeah, it's like, so okay, so Christian fundamentalists are crazy for believing dinosaurs, yeah, or what, don't exist or whatever it is. But then you bring a basic concept to them and they can't handle it. So it kind of cuts both ways. The 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 thing for me is like that I've been kind of hinting at for a while when I'm rambling on my own streams, not very well prepared, but is that I just wish that you've probably heard me say this before, but that let's say in Dublin we could go to the Sugar Club or various like hip venues where debates and discussions and music can be done or whatever, and that it would be some crazy lefty. It would be a sort of a Collison brothers type person. They're not really lefty, but they're just sort of ignoring the things we've discussed. And then you have Angela Nagel and you have yourself and you have, yeah, all these different people there, high quality people hashing it out, debating. And of course, the discussion wouldn't go all your way. I think you would have the winning argument in general. But there would it would actually challenge. We all know, oh, they would be so owned, liberals owned, but there'd be an extent to which you or I or someone like that would be owned to an extent as well. We'd have to kind of mediate certain things, and that's I'm just waffling a bit, but like I would love if these tech bro people with practical blueprint solutions to the world's problems, such as housing and everything else, they would just sit down, and even if they said, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in metaphysics necessarily, but I will look at the stats of, be it IQ, be it gender, be it child rearing. I'll look at all these things on even on my own technocratic level, and I will just reconcile with them just as a person who is thinking, or at least I'll debate and hash it out, and so we'll arrive at some sort of consensus that makes sense. I mean, I'm just going to leave it there because I want to get on to the next question. But I just wish we could, someone like you, someone you've become very well esteemed, like globally and all this in certain circles. Like, why is it not that these technocrats and these, whether it's Steven Pinker or whoever else, that we can't have those debates? I mean, you and I know the answer to that, but it's just a pity, because if that were the case, we could have really, really robust conversations, and it's regrettable. But I'll just go on to the next sort of question I have. It's just a quote from you. I hope I have a question after this. You said, I believe decentralization of the modern period was driven by socio-political and military technological trends which are no longer operative. So I don't know if you kind of absorb that, but what do you mean by that? By socio-political and military technological trends which are no longer operative, that led to decentralization of the current sort of era. What are those?
Well, I mean, if you look at the 20th century, obviously it's like modernity on steroids, right? It's we're going to space, we're building the atom bombs, we're building the hydrogen bombs, we're developing the internet. But like the trend of technology, I mean, that's the first thing. Like in terms of decentralization, there was a realization in the 19th century that this technology of the larger nation state was very powerful. It kind of came from England originally, but I mean, once Germany like created this industrial nation state and united all the different provinces, it was kind of like game over, and that kind of became a universal model. And then just with geopolitical competition and so on. Obviously, at one point in the 20th century, you had the Soviet Union, the US. It's like bipolar world order, like huge spheres of influence. But why is it going their direction? I mean, if you look at a computer in the 1990s, it was like it was the size of a two-story house. And the trend of all these technologies has been to be developed by either a monopoly or like the military industrial complex. It's like, you look at your smartphone, the GPS, the camera, pretty much all the technology in it was either developed by NASA or DARPA or some other wing of the US government, and totally funded by a centralized state. The libertarian idea about innovation is totally wrong. Basically, it's like most of the great innovations that have created huge companies, even the internet, like came from the military. So it's always very centralized. But I mean, the trend of all those technologies has been to reach a mass and become commonplace. And I think all of the kind of trends of technology right now are decentralizing, whether it's something like cryptocurrency is an obvious example, probably doesn't have a huge sociological effect. But I mean, the internet is the most obvious thing. I mean, what's happening now is quite profound in terms of the collapse in trust in mass media. I mean, I know we kind of take this for granted now, okay, people are checking out of mass media, they're not reading newspapers anymore. But that is quite a profound change in terms of there has been like a central media apparatus that's created the public consciousness for 200 plus years. And basically, in the space of a decade, the trust in that has gone off a cliff. And we're still in the very early stages of that, and we don't know how exactly that's going to play out. But, it is leading to this kind of tribalization. It is leading to the growth of these outsider movements. And it's kind of hard to see this stuff happening when you're in the middle of it. But, I mean, you look at the amount of publishers that are into this and right. You look at the kind of thing like you look at AFPAC that's happening in the US, and there's going to be like over 1,000 people there. It's all organized online. It's going to get huge viewership. Hundreds of thousands of people will watch it. Lots of things are possible with technology now that would never have been possible before. I mean, 10, 20 years ago, I could have just been frozen out, and who would ever hear my takes if I wasn't employed by a mainstream media organization, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, even in terms of like what I talked about earlier, like the spread of nationalism, the spread of the idea of popular sovereignty, the Soviet Union really crumbled into these smaller nation states, to smaller nationalisms that made this kind of multi-ethnic empire impossible at a certain point. The way warfare has trended in terms of like that older form of imperialism basically becoming impossible if you're trying to occupy a hostile population. So all of the kinds of trends of technology right now is heading towards like disintermediation, decentralization, like smaller blocks of sovereignty. And that's why I don't buy this idea that like, well, it's just going to be empires forever. And, if we're not in the US empire, we'll be in the Russian empire. And like, this is kind of just how the world goes, as nation states just get swapped over and back between big centralized forces. I don't think that's the kind of historical period we're heading towards.
Okay, that's interesting. So it's kind of like I like the narrative. Like someone could argue the facts, of course. I actually agree with you on it, but it's sort of like I agree that you're factually probably right about that. It makes sense, but just in terms of like moralization and narrative and rhetoric, it's that's good too. It's like the idea that same with something else we mentioned a while ago, that it's actually with like the printed press and with the internet, these things actually evoke the issues of identity as opposed to suppressing them, which is completely flies in the face of liberal orthodoxies. Just one last thing on that. Oh, by the way, like also 2 points to mention, tangent. One is share this online. If you're watching it, share it and give it a boost while you're at it, like give it another level. And 2, for Keith, if I won't keep it too long, but if you are starting to get out of it, just DM me and just wrap it up. I will.
No,
so, or you can just tell me here. So you also said today a centralized variant of corporatism is the basis for the Chinese economic model. Now I wrote this essay I was happy about, Descendants of the Dragon, and like it was about like immigration, demographics, and the future of civilization. And it kind of ties into all this stuff, but they are doing their own thing. So again, this globalist project in the West is not being followed. If you're interested, Descendants of the Dragon, Garrod Murphy Substack, you can read a whole article about it. Steve Saylor did one years ago, kind of on the same subject. I think mine's better. Read that. They basically do no immigration, and they have a centralized economic and social structure, more or less, and it's working very, very well. But this is more of a point than a question, so I'll move on. But I was thinking, like the Chinese system at this point, I think this is beyond debate. The Chinese social and political domestic situation probably requires less management and control than does the West now. So the US, the UK, Ireland, it's kind of a shocking thing, isn't it? Based on what we were raised on, the Great Firewall of China, mass surveillance, social credit systems. If objectively, their system probably requires much less control at this point because they're working in accordance with some version of human nature. It's kind of mad, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, there's something about the Chinese temperament. I think that not everyone in the world is super keen on having a liberal democracy and is super upset about being under a dictatorship. I definitely think that gets exaggerated in terms of how desperate the Chinese are for freedom. But yeah, I mean, a lot of that gets overplayed as well. I mean, even the social credit score was like trialed in a couple of cities, but it isn't a Chinese-wide thing. But yeah, I mean, they've basically, if you look at their model, I mean, there's so much kind of ideology about this, because communists will claim it as their own, of course, and people hear the Chinese Communist Party and alarm bells, and of course, there's that kind of strain of neoconservatism that wants to focus everything on the threat of Red China. But if you look at the system they've adopted and you just take away ideology, I mean, it's just developmental nationalism, basically. It's what most countries were doing in the early 20th century. It's a mixed economy. They have billionaires. They have class collaboration managed by the state. I mean, it's basically a variant of fascism, and it's just run on a...
I was going to say it's socialism with Chinese characteristics. And it's funny that that's how they phrase it. And in the Soviet Union, they ended up resorting to socialism in one country. These are both just euphemisms for what you just mentioned. It's kind of gas or funny. So I'll just kind of skip on to your discussion about demography, basically the other essay. So just one thing that I was curious about. You said this is in a totally different essay, actually. You called it The Age of Mass Democracy. This is in December 23. You said the mass democratic form of the Western capitalist model is no more hegemonic and anti-fragile than ever. Does that ring a bell? Have you changed your view since then, or does that reconcile with your current view? So the mass democratic form of the Western capitalist model is now more hegemonic and anti-fragile than ever. So is there a distinction there between mass democracy and liberalism? Like what do you mean when you say necessarily mass democracy? What are the distinctions there?
Yeah, well, mass democracy, I mean, this comes from this Greek philosopher Condylis, that he said, to compare like modern liberalism to classical liberalism, bourgeois liberalism, you run into a lot of contradictions. And really, if you want to understand today's system of government, it's kind of unique in terms of it's not really run on any like fundamental like liberal or individualistic principles. It is just this like mass productivity form that's began in the early 20th century, and especially like after the Cold War, where there was just this kind of global consensus reached in terms of you have an industrial economy, you have a mass of wage workers, you have a mass of consumers and producers, and you have mass democracy as a political form. And the People's Republic of North Korea, the Islamic Republic of Iran, like the Chinese People's Republic. I mean, these still like look for their justification in like satisfying some kind of mass popular democracy or sovereignty. So yeah, there was this kind of great synthesis. I mean, that's why a lot of the talk of like capitalism versus socialism is just so outdated. Because it's like to compare, like I said, compare China versus the US. China has much more inequality than a lot of apparently hyper-capitalist states. There is just great like sort of Keynesian economic consensus that just exists the world over, and like the capitalism socialism thing, I mean, it's really just a kind of continuum of how much the state interferes or how much distribution there is. So that's kind of the point of talking about it as like, well, it's all just mass democracy, is, to get outside some of the kind of ideological spooks of like classical liberalism versus communism or any of this kind of thing. And it's basically like, look, every country is basically just this great technocracy that runs on a mixed economy with some kind of Keynesian principles that looks for a certain amount of economic growth a year, where everyone is a producer consumer that is integrated into the labor system, and there's a kind of global atomization process happening. And really a lot of the kind of 20th century ideological distinctions are basically outdated at this point.
Okay.
And that's kind of my belief as well. So at that point, it's like, well, really the only kind of important question is like, well, what, in what interest is the elite kind of running that technocracy then? And obviously in the West, it's a globalist kind of denationalized elite that is purely running it for personal gain and economic growth, whereas at least in some of the China as an example, there's more of a sense of a traditional national interest there.
Same with BJP in India. So that kind of leads on to the key point of your demographic argument. So one of the things you wrote in your demography or essay on Substack, Keith Wood, Substack.ie, whatever it is, subscribe.
Keith Wood's up.
The Keith Wood's up, but is and you mentioned this in your live stream about it too, which was actually very good. I'm impressed by how coherent it was. Just a live stream talking about it, but it sounded almost scripted. It was very good. Very coherent. You kind of argued somewhere in between those two things that population decline does actually lead to economic deprivation and difficulty maintaining infrastructure in cities. And one of the things I would lean to is that, no, just let the population decline happen. There was an Australian paper I quoted in my Descendants of the Dragon China essay, which was that, like, well, propping up the country with immigrants or really just trying to even expand the birth rate, it doesn't necessarily work the way we think it does, or the way Elon Musk talks about. That, especially with immigration, we know it's a Ponzi scheme. But so I was kind of reacting to that general narrative by saying, oh, well, no, see, it turns out that if we just let the demography go the way it goes, actually that would be a relief on people's lives, and you would have more houses to go around. You would have, things would relax a little bit, more school places, all of this. And we just gradually, organically restore this kind of internal order within nations. And you sort of hinted at that. Well, and I'm not saying you're disagreeing with that entirely, but you hinted that, like, well, it's not so simple. There would be pain experienced by demographic decline or even stagnation. You mentioned growth-based economies. So never mind decline, even just stagnation would lead to it's not just something that George Soros or a globalist is telling you, that according to you, there's actually a genuine downside or pain to be felt if that happens. Can you kind of go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, again, I agree with you. I mean, like, eventually, people make this argument. They say, well, our population is shrinking, so we have to import new people. And it's like, well, when does that end? Like, is every country just going to expand its population forever? Like, at a certain point, you have to be okay with, the population is going to decline for a few years or a few decades, and we're going to actually plan how to manage that. Like, I don't think it's ideal that there's going to be like 12 billion people in the world in the middle of the century. But yeah, it takes a lot of planning. And the obvious problem is we have an economy that's built on growth, and generally, healthy economy needs like 3-4% growth a year. And it's not just a case of, if that doesn't happen, everyone has 3% less income. It's like the way our system runs, it's a recession if you have 2 quarters of no growth, and then you get 3/4 of depression, because loans can't be paid. Things that were paid for with future growth don't get paid for. And unfortunately, the way a capitalist economic system works is it leads to perpetual crisis if you don't have growth. So it does create difficulties. I mean, these cities like Detroit that have become kind of ghost cities in areas and have had a much smaller population. I mean, it creates all sorts of problems in terms of infrastructure and cities' loan systems and so on. But again, it's a question of priorities. I mean, it's something that we've seen on the horizon for decades, or elites have seen on the horizon, and there's just no plan. If you talk to the kind of people that believe in this project, they really don't give a lot of thought to this, of, well, what's going to happen if the country's birth rate falls below replacement, which has been happening here for the last decade. And, well, what's going to happen if it falls below 1.5, or what's going to happen if it falls to 1.2? There is a sense of just like the market will figure things out, and basically replacement immigration will fix that. but yeah, I would hope there's a. I mean, I would hope there's a political limit to how much they can do to replacement immigration. But yeah, I do think there's definitely a correlation between depopulation and economic deprivation. But the other interesting thing about that is, and I linked it in that article, is there's a strong link between that and populism. Like there was a study on this that showed that like the areas that most swung from Mitt Romney in 2012 to Trump in 2016 were areas that had a big decline in population and like loss of industry and other things that came with that. And they actually found the same thing for nationalist parties in Italy and the Yellow Vest movement in France. So it is quite socially disruptive. And I guess, then you extend that out to all of Europe and you think of the big population collapse that is coming with the collapse in birth rates. It could have interesting political ramifications. But yeah, I do think it's kind of a pill to swallow that, yeah, it probably is going to lead to some economic stagnation and crisis if there's a population collapse. And the basis for that essay was actually a different essay by an Irish economist, Philip Pilkington. He's quite an interesting guy. But that was his argument. He's an economist, and he talks a lot about like the move to multipolar world. But his argument was basically like capitalism has this tendency to collapse birth rates, and as they collapse, GDP per capita collapses, and the ability to fund social services. And his argument was that it's going to mean the end of capitalism, that it can't sustain itself if it can't continually have an expanding population, but it cannibalizes its own population, it craters birth rates, and so on a long enough timeline, capitalism kind of necessarily eats itself because it can't replace its own human capital. And that was what led me to write that essay, was just to kind of dig deeper into like, well, what are the real trends of the birth rates in terms of if capitalism is going to like destroy itself from, turning everyone incel, like what's going to come after, who's actually going to have the kids.
Yeah.
But I think that basic like insight of his that system can't really be sustained is probably correct. Yeah.
But like that sort of end of the road period of capitalism, like you said, Marx didn't account for it, but that and Philip Pink, I can't pronounce that name. I'm just too late in the night now.
Pilkington.
Pilkington. He as he observed that, like, well, the real end of the line is the limit of like new meat, new bodies into the scenario for economic growth. And it's kind of like when you think about that, whatever, even if the West does immigration, does its whole thing, by about 2100, the African population, the final big growth population, tops out anyway. So regardless of what happens just in the West, if the West dies as a civilization, regardless, just on a humanity level, this has an end of the line anyway, and it'll all go to shit long before that anyway. But it's like, that's how it sort of connects to like the ongoing thing in Ireland with plantations, politicians not listening, and the need for economic growth and development. The whole story in Ireland, it links to this story, which I think is world historical. Like it's not, it's on a par with the discovery of fossil fuels, the electricity, the written word. You know, this is a major a major global turning point, like on the scale of multiple centuries, that level of history. And yet, so when we're seeing all this consternation and insanity on the ground in Ireland, what you were seeing is this demographic issue and the capitalist expansionist requirement for more people. You were seeing that globally world historic event panning out in front of us and the chaos ensuing from it. So it's, it really is sort of the magnitude of the times we're living in and what we're seeing on a daily basis are greater than I think a lot of people appreciate. But I'll just move on. I want to just race through it because you'll get tired, I'll get tired, and everyone else will too. Quick answer for this, if like rapid fire. You said the core contradiction at the heart of this project about globalism and all that is that the alienation from tribal humanity is integral to modernity, and also at the root of the demographic crisis. It's a contradiction. I'm just wondering, why do you think that alienation from tribal humanity is integral to modernity?
Well, I suppose it doesn't necessarily have to be, if all of us were in charge. But I mean, as it stands, it's modernity the modern system is directing people towards porn and video games and isolation, alienation, late marriage, late family formation, drug use, addictive behavior, and a social system, an ideology that, like we've been discussing for much this stream, that takes them out of any kind of ethnic or collective consciousness. And as it turns out, actually, you need collective consciousnesses, you need traditional religious views, you need traditional values to be the type of person to have enough kids to replace the population. So that is kind of the core contradiction at the heart of the project. Yeah, is you have look at the rate of inceldom. There's just a huge population now that are just just totally checked out of the dating market. They're online all day. They're various addictions.
Online all
the
day.
system is kind of cannibalizing its own population.
Yeah. I don't want to point the finger at someone who's online a lot. I'd say I am. I'd say probably you are as well a little bit. But anyway, it is a modern issue. It was funny because I threw that to you as a rapid fire question, but it's kind of the one that would require a bit of thinking about. So that's not exactly fair. Racing through it. So it's not very natural for me to just refer to my piece of paper, but this is just a comment from someone on one of your essays that I found interesting. It's not even a question. It's someone called Jason Bowden. He said, as regards it's too late to get into it, but your point is that religious people, nationalist people from like kind of those tendencies will inherit the earth. They'll breed, they're inspired, and they will multiply. So as you bring in immigrants, at the same time, Mormons explode. In an Irish context, I looked, there are no studies on this, but I met a traveler in a playground a few days ago, a mother she said she had 11 kids. How often do you hear about that? So travelers, people in working class communities, people who are in like some sort of weird ideology, people who are so-called far right, you'll find these different, or usually it's just working class people will and liberals will just totally die off. This is your argument, and it's obviously true. This commenter on your article, Jason Bowden, said, on the other side of modernity, considering the current era is like a bottleneck, on the other side of modernity, surviving natalist whites will have preferences for power distance and group orientation closer to African and Asian populations. This will occur with or without mass immigration. So it's just fascinating to think that even in an Irish context, the kids who were screaming, get them out in Dublin, liberals were recoiling at seeing that. And I was just saying to someone on Twitter, well, anything you're going to produce when you freeze your eggs or go to the LGBTQ plus sauna, well, they're not going to be there shouting any slogan of any fashion, right? Whatever comes of that. Whereas these working class kids, general Irish kids, will be there. So that's a really, I just think it's in your essay about demographics, your second most recent essay. People can go check it out. But it's a fascinating thing to put out there, which is why I put the thumbnail as like this techno dystopia in the background with the guy from Kulak on the horse in the foreground, almost like a ghost of the past, previous tendencies returning into and as a consequence of the dystopia. It's fascinating. But here's just a question. That was just a point. So I was wondering, like, why do you think the birth rate is actually collapsing? You mentioned in Iran it's collapsing. It's a theocracy. So in Georgia, your man is going around this like theocratic leader, blessing everyone, christening kids, and that's inspiring people to have kids. And you have data on that. And yet Iran is a theocracy, so I don't expect you and I certainly don't know the details of what they do with pronatalist policies, but they are also a theocracy, they're identity-based, religious-based, and yet it's collapsing there as well. So regardless of the consequences, whether we should accept the birth rate decline and it's no big deal, or whether it's a kind of bad, what is it? Just modernity, technology, or something like that?
Yeah, Iran's an interesting case. I mean, I must look into that more. I would imagine the reason is much more economic there. But yeah, it's a collection of factors. I mean, the key problem is, for the most part, if you give people complete freedom over their own lives, is generally people don't want to get married and settle down until their 30s, and in an open, or their late 20s, and in a kind of open dating field, there is this kind of Pareto principle with women, where they all want the top 20% of men. And sometimes when we talk about like trad society and people glorify the trad life, I think they forget how much of necessity some of this stuff was, in terms of having to marry young and have a lot of kids, and create a family, like in place of any welfare system, and how much of these marriages were more or less arranged, if that wasn't explicit. So yeah, I mean, just necessarily with the choice that modernity brings, a lot of people prefer childless lifestyles. A lot of people prefer to have fewer kids. There's obviously contraception and all the options that's brought by modernity. And so it is a kind of selection event, in terms of, there needs to be something psychologically there that would compel a population to replace themselves, which has not been the historical norm. There's economics to a degree. I mean, I saw you were posting that stat recently. What is it, like 78% of men under 30 are living with their parents? It's like, how is anyone meant to start a family if that's the case, right? And that's a thing in a lot of the Southern European countries as well, as they have huge rates of young people living at home. But for the most part, yeah, I mean, this is, it's in Asia, it's in every Asian country, it's in Iran. It's happening in, like, I think Turkey is below replacement, Albania, Bosnia, the Muslim countries. It's obviously happening in Europe. This is just something that modernity brings. The economics of it, like I said, the individual choice, the feminism, contraception. There's just a confluence of factors that are not incentivizing people to start families young. So yeah, then the question is, well, what will possibly counter that if that's just what's on offer now, and everyone can have these life choices? And yeah, the answer is religion. Religious groups have a lot of children. The two countries I mentioned were Georgia and Israel, which are very kind of unique because they have a very strong ethnic national consciousness. They have religious values, but they're not. Neither country is actually super religious, but there's a kind of social, kind of collective consciousness, understanding of traditional values. I quoted a study on Israel that it used the term familism. So it was talking about secular Jews, because I mean the like Haredi traditional Jews in Israel have, like, on average, their women have 7 or 8 kids, which is gigantic. But there's a lot of religious fanaticism there. But what's interesting about Israel is, if you look at the secular Jews, it has an atheist population that has an above replacement birth rate. And so I cited some stuff on that. And yeah, it is basically like they're hyper nationalistic. They have a very strong ethnic sense. They have this sense of being in that, having kids is this great patriotic thing, obviously, because they're in direct, like, demographic confrontation with the Palestinians. And they have what this study called familism, which is just this ideology around, like, traditional values and the virtue of raising kids. So yeah, you need, like, Ed Dutton talks about this a lot, that this is like the new kind of evolutionary selection pressure, where, like, a huge amount of types of people are going to disappear from the gene pool. And he did projections on this based on birth rates. And it's like the 5% most radical left population, the people that identify as radical left, they're about 5% of the population. And on his projections, in a century, they'll be under 1%. So it will be, like, profoundly transformative. But yeah, basically, you need some kind of ideology, you need some kind of collective group strategy that can overcome those incentives that exist on the individual level. And for now, all we have for that kind of thing is religion. And like I said, in some unique cases, you have a national consciousness that's enough to encourage those kinds of values. So yeah, it's going to be profoundly transformative, because on the level of the state, it doesn't seem like liberal states or states anywhere have much in the way of ideas of what they're going to do to reverse this.
No, and that's it's the interesting question, is, like, and ultimately, like, I think the issue is whether it's for these technocrats or techno-feudalists or whatever it is, or whether it's the standard government. The issue, like, the people they need to bring into the conversation, I'm not sure if you want to join them to have discussions, but is people kind of like you to sit at the table, at the very least, just speak some. I mean, it's a big gaping elephant in the room, or a big obvious elephant in the room. It's like, come on, like, stop just trying to shut it out, pretend it's not there, just address it. But I agree with you. It's sort of like your theories were like, so economic incentives like Hungary are not enough. You need this nationalist fervor. You need religious feeling as well, all of that. And you just alluded to it there. I think you need all of those things. And then you also have the evolutionary bottleneck, where the people who just don't want to have kids, it just doesn't occur to them naturally as an idea. Like, to me, it never occurred to me, like, why or the logic of it. I just wanted to. So there needs to be a kind of a little selection event happening there. So it's all of those things, but all of those things need to happen in conjunction. Otherwise, you just immigrate Africans who are going to run out in 2100 anyway, and you're going to have like complete breakdown before that. So you take your pick. But so we're near the end, right? It's been a long stream. I'll get to super chats, which I'll race through quickly. I can't leave without talking a small bit, the smallest segment, about just the Irish article you had and Ireland in general. I'm delighted that this will be the minority of this stream, because I talk about Ireland every night, and anytime I get invited on a stream, no disrespect to anyone, they just want to ask me about Ireland. So I've been craving for a long time to have a live stream discussion with someone about just things, ideas, not just like the goings on in Ireland. But with that said, I want to get into a little bit. You had an essay called "The End of." What was the title? "The End of the Great Consensus." The
end of Ireland's Great Consensus. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've said that if you're like a not Irish and you just want to read about the general 20-30 year trajectory of how we got from like the Ireland everyone has in their mind to what we have now and where we're at, it's like a one-stop shop. Excellent essay. But so like one of the good points he made I loved was just that we don't have to do strained WN that other countries seem to have to do for some reason, because they're lacking some sort of like ingrained nationalism, I don't know, our historical revisions, and we don't have to traipse around all that stuff. It just comes to us easy. I think that's the biggest benefit we've had as like content creators and people like Phil and all that we're walking into this environment, this kind of landscape that has that, which makes it so much easier. But something I wanted to ask you is that, like, we talk. I'm not trying to say that you're a demographic growth person, like you're like Elon Musk or something. You only made a point. You're only granting the devil its due. I'm not trying to hang it on you, but like insofar as that has some truth to it, I was thinking in Ireland we had a lot of the estates, prolific estates in Ireland, like nice housing estates, were built in the 1940s. So many houses are like from thereabouts. This great kind of new nation building that they had going on then. And we right now they're talking about creaking water and electricity infrastructure in Ireland, that it's at its wit's end because of population growth. And when you read those articles, they'll say that much of this infrastructure, especially the water, was built in the 40s and it's still being used. It's almost like the state has this apathy now where it's so geared into bringing in private tech companies, kissing their asses, just taking the check from them and suppressing the population, bringing in lots of people to boost the magic GDP line go up, that they've kind of, it's almost like there isn't actually a state on board that's actually doing things that a state you would think would do, which is an argument against the idea of like demographic growth and how much it's needed for a city infrastructure and all of that. Like a city's infrastructure would struggle with demographic decline. It's like, well, they're not doing a whole lot of it anyway under the current circumstances. And it just got me thinking, Ireland, like from the whole Celtic Tiger era up till now, which is one of the greatest economic GDP booms we have ever seen, we have like the Port Tunnel, like a little tunnel in Dublin. We have the Lewis, which is a tram, which we had lots of 100 years ago. It's just a tram in one city. And we have motorways, which they have, like, think of Myanmar, which is the most like militarized, ethnic-based country ever. They have this massive motorway through the middle of Myanmar. No one's on it, but they were able to build it. We have phones and internet, which they have in Mongolia, which is the least densely populated planet on Earth. Not exactly like a tech hub. So when I look at Ireland, I kind of think, well, all of this demographic growth, I struggle to see what the actual fruits of it are at all. Even if we're trying to give, even if we're going out of our way to give the devil its due, I struggle to see where the benefit there is at all. Like, what do you think?
No, I agree with you. I mean, it's not like we have some huge labor crisis either. I mean, we do have a below replacement birth right now, but that's actually quite recent. Like, it's only the last 10 years. It's not really impacting like the workforce or anything, at least not yet. And yeah, I mean, that's always been kind of notable about Ireland as well. I remember after the financial crash in 2008-9, like people were kind of looking around, and it's like, wow, we had like the most successful economy in the world, like just on raw figures, like insane GDP growth rates, insane rates of everything. And it was like, yeah, now we're in like 64 billion debt, huge deficit, bank bailout, Troika in Dublin. And it was like, yeah, what do we have to show for it? Like, you got the Lewis. We never got the Bertie Bowl. What else was there? Like a couple of motorways. And it's like, yeah, we used to have a hugely interconnected rail system that we just got rid of. In the way of public services, it's really kind of shocking how far behind we are in a lot of ways. I was in Budapest last year. It's on paper it's a poorer country than Ireland, but it's like Budapest. It seems like it's 50 years ahead of Dublin just in terms of public transport and the way everything operates.
Okay, so you get those technological benefits, but then also you get like mainly a lot of people there are Hungarians, like a greater degree of social normality. Plus, it's like so you kind of go, the GDP is worse. Maybe the countryside is a little bit poor because they say it's a bit different when you get outside Budapest. But regardless, the country functions reasonably well, give or take. In China, like the thing when we argue with technocrats in Ireland, we say, can we not bring in 200,000 people a year, like 5% of the population? I don't know, it's just an idea. And they say, oh, you're away with the fairies. What are you thinking? We wouldn't have running water and electricity if we didn't do that. And it's kind of like you look at China, which has for a while now had below replacement birth rates. And in that time, in Shanghai, they went from no metro system at all to the largest, most extensive, most sophisticated and affordable one in the world within 20 years, no immigration basically. So it's a kind of like, there's huge room for this stuff to just be challenged because it's so common sense. We have the data. But the final kind of point I want to like,
I mean, especially in Ireland's case as well, because it's such a it's such a high tech kind of modern economy. There's even less of a need of like we have to be constantly expanding the labor force. So much of the growth comes from kind of ethereal stuff that isn't directly wage labor, and like it is basically just a giant subsidy to landlords and a certain class of business owner. I mean, I'm not like going full communist here or anything, but at the end of the day, like, what are most of these immigrants doing? Like, it's one of the biggest population growths in the history of the world, like 3.5% in a year. And it's like, yeah, we need them to work in the cafes and the hotels and all this kind of thing. So it's like, if those people weren't there, I guess like the wages for those things would be higher. Landlords would be able to charge less. Maybe there'd be a little bit of inflation. Maybe the cafe prices would be a bit higher. But it's like, at the end of the day, that is basically a great kind of public subsidy to a certain class of capitalists. Like landlords make money. Immigration, according to some studies, is actually a huge net negative for society as a whole. But sometimes it's a question of, well, who's paying for it? And if you're a landlord and if you're renting out some of these facilities, you're probably doing better than ever. So, okay, society as a whole, it may be a net negative, but that doesn't mean if you're some of these people, you're not doing better than ever right now. So it is this kind of collective subsidy to a certain class of people at the expense of others. Never mind at the expense of destroying the nation, but.
You've kind of answered it. It's like the penultimate question, then quick super chats, and I'm sorry for letting it go so long. Which was like, I just add to your point as well, by the way, if you cut all that, these subsidies to landlords and all of these classes would decline to like whoever. And yet as the technocrats would argue about, big companies, the Viagra would still get made in Cork. The semiconductors would still get made in Leixlip. There's only a couple of thousand people who work in Leixlip in a 30 billion euro semiconductor fab. And yet you don't need hundreds of people to be put into Cahersiveen in the west of Ireland. It's got nothing to do with that. So it's like, again, you could cut immigration like 90, a massive percentage, and you could still make semiconductors in Leixlip. I mean, it's only a small number of people involved in that, immigrants and all. So it's like the arguments just fall apart. And it does come back to this exploitation thing. And so you've answered this question already, but I'll say, I was going to say the similarity of this plantation to the previous ones in Ireland. I was going to ask you, like, how much, because you talk about liberalism and mass democracy and all of these things, and those things are valid, but I was going to ask you, like, how much of what's going on isn't an ideological thing or historical peculiarities, but just an expression of greed, exploitation, and power run amok. I think I'm not going to ask you. I think you answered it, but where it is just a case of those base things just run amok. I don't know, is this a point or a question? It'll be the last thing anyway. In your, which article, the demographic one, you were, it's too late for you to answer this really, but you talked about your ideal is the small organic city state, subsidiarity and all of that. And I was just going to say, like, how does that compete with, because of technology in the world as it is, economies of scale, frictionless capitalism? How can subsidiarity and city states and natural forms compete with the power of capitalist productivity, in a sense, frictionless, borderless, and all of that? At a certain sense, even though what you're talking about might be good and right, it's just, it cannot be stronger by its own nature than this other thing, which will just take it over and destroy it, that kind of way. But then I was about to ask that question, and then as I was reading your article, and you mentioned it collapses under its own weight. Basically, like, this monstrosity, actually, as strong as it is productively, it will actually collapse under its own contradictions, in a sense, which is kind of like almost like a Marxist analysis of globalism in a funny kind of way. And what you got onto was that you think it's cyclical. It's this kind of, it just goes around and around. Do you think that's what we're in now? Is that we're in this collapse of the centralized order, and it's going to collapse under its own weight, and so we're returning to a city state, and maybe in a long time in the future it'll go around and around? Do you believe in that cyclical kind of thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think those things will still exist in terms of, the US, like NASA is still going to exist, and there's still going to be like hyper centralized research and so on. I think, the entity of China is kind of resistant to these trends, but kind of resistant because it's just like a gigantic, like, in a weird way, it's like a gigantic small nation, which sounds weird, but it is very kind of cohesive and homogeneous. But no, I think those things will still exist, but that's kind of how collapse happens often. Is like, well, the centralized state continues to exist, and maybe it still delivers your post and the trains run on time, but it just doesn't really interject so much in your life in terms of your consciousness, in terms of generating mass culture. I think it'll be some kind of gradual decentralization like that, in terms of the existence of more kind of ethnic enclaves, more kind of startup cultures outside the center. But it'll depend on the country. Ireland is still a very cohesive unit. I don't think I think the strategy here has to be in terms of the nation as a whole, and very much aiming for state power ultimately. If I was in the US, maybe some kind of enclavism, some kind of forming an independent community, and trying to have as much sort of independence as possible would be the way to go. But in Europe, on the level of the state, the nation, I think that's still kind of the operative level in terms of how you speak to people, in terms of trying to get any kind of populist or nationalist movement going. And yeah, I think that's what our effort should be aimed at, is the nation state.
That's interesting. So as always, there's kind of nuance. It's not that, like, you go between these, like, black and white, decentralized globalism and subsidiarity city states. It doesn't, obviously reality isn't so straightforward.
There's actually an Irish guy on YouTube. I don't think he's political. He did a really good video on this topic recently. Let me try and find it. I think it was something like, what would an independent Cork look like?
Was it policy by any chance?
Yeah, that rings a bell. Could Cork be independent? Policy. But that's his topic seems to be that kind of thing, of how you could have a more efficient system in terms of dealing with housing, dealing with all these things, by just giving more power to regionalism, more power to local councils. And I was actually thinking of just transfiguring into my Substack an essay by Desmond Fennell, who was kind of advocating this thing. He's an Irish nationalist, but he was kind of advocating this thing as well of running Europe on a kind of regionalist level, and going back to a more local level, take dependence on these financial centers away. It kind of ties into that video essay that guy made. But I thought that video was really good because he kind of talks about like practically how a lot of the current problems, like be it housing or immigration, like a lot of those things could be worked out in a much smoother way if you just like gave more power to localities.
And that's a big thing I've harped back on like 7 times in this video, but is that I want the policies, all credit to them, and all these other sort of like creative, futuristic tech, like, oh, let's build train lines to places in the middle of nowhere and the city will pop up around them, and all these things are cool, right? And these subsidiarity and the rest of it, they kind of cross paths with us a little bit, but I want them to sort of cross the Rubicon a little bit more and move towards discussions about human nature, which is what the last 3 of your essays sort of converged on a little bit. Is like, I want that bright millennial cadre of people who are searching for change but are still trying to paint within inside the lines to sort of move out a little bit, talk about trains, talk about phone chargers, talk about decentralization, but also like, can we talk about just human beings a little bit? You don't have to come all the way over, but can we just kind of like cross that line a little bit and break down those barriers? So look, that's that. I'm going to go to super chats quickly. I would like to let you go because you probably have lots of other things to do, but I suppose I have to hang on to you because they might be aimed at you as well. So I'll fly through these. So Finola America, there is a way of putting these on the screen, by the way. I don't know how to do it. Next time I'll figure it out. Finola Omer to... I just click it.
Yeah.
I just clicked it and nothing happened. It just gave me options. Yeah, it just brought me to her channel. So I click it and then...
Are you clicking it on YouTube?
Yes.
No, click it in the... on StreamYard in the starred. Yeah. Go to starred in the comments.
Starred. Ah, very good. Okay. So if I do this,
there you go. You can just do it with live comments as well, like any comments.
I love this. By the way, for those who don't know, Keith's been on to me recently, trying to like inspire me to kind of improve things a little bit. Little gentle nudges, and I appreciate that.
This is why you got to send them super chats.
Yeah, I hate technology. I hate, and you know yourself that like people wouldn't realize, but like you think you set it up, you figure it out, and then you just go live every night and it's frictionless and it's, you figured it out. There's, as you had tonight with your camera, there's always something that usually works fine. Suddenly it doesn't. It's changed. And so it is a pain in the ass. So people should know that. Keep going, Gerald. Thanks, Finola. I appreciate that. Armchair Limerick Nationalist says, well done, Garrod. Please scald Keith for his Wi-Fi issues. I should look, we'll get over it. I had issues on his channel in the past, so it's fair is fair. Thanks for that, Armchair Limerick Nationalist. Appreciate it. James Bond gives £20 and says, James Bond says, use your weapon, use your vote, vote for whoever Garrod says to vote for. Exactly. I wish people would just do that. But everyone must vote. Protect our Irish ballot box. Very true. Ed the Statesman says, keep her lit, Garrod. Incredible content. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Dermloft, €5. No comment. Cheers. Martin O'Brien, €12. Well done, lads. Great work. Cheers. Teacher Connor, €10. Disappointed that 20 days out from the election, you're not calling out the men to help candidates canvass and leaflet. 10 helpers per candidate would get you all elected. Logistics, be pragmatic. 2 weeks. Well, people do different things. Sometimes people talk about the demographic bottleneck of our civilization era.
No, you should all go canvass and leaflet with the 20 days left.
Yeah, and Keith's with the National Party. And, the time for registering is come and gone. But assuming you're registered and you just get too lazy to vote or something, like that's the problem. You have to go out and do it, and you have to whisper to your auntie and your mum and whatever and just say, listen, stop listening to RTE, go vote for Derek Bly and Philip Dwyer and Patrick Quinlan, the rest of them. Just do it, because you never know what'll make the difference. Who knows what'll happen? So yeah, sorry to disappoint you, but we're doing our best, and everyone should vote.
You got to do something anyway. I mean, it's you think of where we are now in history. I mean, if something doesn't happen in the next few years, Well, I mean, when you look at that graph that says like 3.5% per year and like one of the biggest migrations in history, it's like imagine 5-10 years of this. We've already almost caught up with Britain. It's just happening so fast. We're so late in the day. We're
Yeah.
almost already too late in terms of where we're starting from, but we just have to do what we can. So yeah, even it's everyone can do something. Like even the some of the graphs that have gone around recently, like, there's been some helpful kind of graphics in terms of like visualizing the population change. Like it's showing the minority status of Irish in inner city Dublin. Some people have made helpful graphics. I even think just like sending that kind of thing to as many people as possible and getting them thinking in terms of like immigration isn't just the guy that works down the shop, but there is actually, there's a people here, there's a broader trend happening, and it's political. Like that's a kind of a very basic starting point, but like everyone needs to at least be on that page, right?
I agree with you. Everybody needs to do something. So I kind of like, all respect to the commenter there, but we are on here talking about the issues. I go on streaming a lot. You do all your essays. I mean, it's hardly like we're like, if we're sort of slightly lacking in making one comment about a particular thing, that we're totally useless scumbags who have like betrayed them. It's like, I think you could find someone else in your life to give out to, surely, about like failings. But that said, yeah, everybody can do something. You can do a stream, you can super chat, you can clip videos, you can go out and canvass for your preferred candidate locally, you can do anything yourself. Come up with whatever you can think of. Do whatever you can do. Support someone else, do something yourself, whatever. But just do stuff instead of, and I've seen you mention this multiple times in the past, do stuff, do something, anything, instead of just consuming content. Which is ironic for me to say, but just consume content and consume content and do stuff. Simple enough. So Roddy Murray says, Ballyogan is getting brutal Newtown Mount Kennedy treatment. Thoughts about the future protests and the state response? I'm going to say that, not to reject the question, but if I think we could launch another 2 or 3 hour stream and start talking about like, what are where are we actually going here? Like what's like, do we just keep repeating the same thing over and over again? Is it worth pushing back on them all the time? I don't know what you think, Keith, but it's sort of like,
Well, I think
there's
they will
depths to
crack
that.
down harder. I
Yeah,
think they will crack down harder, but it's one of those things like the power legitimacy. Like the harder they crack down, the worse it looks for them. So
yeah,
keeping it in the public consciousness and raising awareness is kind of a can't lose situation, because if they pull back and change policy, that's great. If they don't and they start using riot police to smash up locals, that's terrible for them electorally. So it's
yeah. There was someone you were fraternizing with recently, I saw in America, was Warren Balog, and he did a speech. You could probably only find it on Odyssey or something, but if you want to find it, you can. I can't remember the title. Oh, he's done a few speeches for the party that had NJP, but I thought some of those speeches were excellent, and one of them he said what you mentioned there, which is, he gave a whole speech detailing it, but his slogan for it was, they can have power or they can have legitimacy, but they can't have both. And that's kind of what it is that, okay, if they're going to have the power to beat everyone out of the way, well, they will rapidly lose their legitimacy. And I think he concluded that once they lose the latter, they will surely lose the former too. So that's my view on it as well. So the Globalist Gazette, €5 says, we enjoy listening to the little people talk about their concerns. Please carry on. Keith's very tall. He's not little. But we're sort of little people maybe as well, in a way. So Bagno Flora, €6, thank you very much, says, can we expose McGurk for talking about the trip to Israel? He won't interview NP, but will interview IFP, who defends Zionism and think the WF run the world. You can talk about that if you want. Personally, people know what I think of McGurk. I like Gript. I even like some of McGurk's articles. He's very clever, and Gript do great work. But I disagree with his kind of like Buckleyite, the Zionist background, and I'm sort of wary of it in general. So that's my view. But I don't like to do mad drama. That's just my view. I've stated that calmly. I don't over egg the pudding and sort of get like hysterical about him. But I mean, you know how I feel about it. So Keith, I don't know. You can either take that question or.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Grip do some good work as well in terms of the raising the issues about immigration, and it's like Ben Scallon's journalistic work. But yeah, I'm not a fan of McGurk. I would think he clearly sees his role as gatekeeping Irish nationalism, and the fact that he wouldn't talk to any NP candidates, I think, is telling. I think the fact that he basically wrote somewhat of a hit piece on Phil Dwyer, calling him sort of, oh, he's the extreme right and I'm like the sensible center. I don't rate that kind of behavior. And then the extreme Zionism as well is, you know how I feel about that.
Yeah, exactly. Free Palestine, and Ireland granted statehood. So isn't that epic? Are you delighted?
Yeah, I'm a government shill now. I'll be voting Fine Gael at the next election. I changed my vote.
Happy days. Okay. That's all the super chats. So I'm going to leave it there. Everybody, thank you for joining in. Thank you for listening. Thank you for contributing, and follow Keith's Substack. It's linked in the description via his bio link. You can follow all my stuff, support the channel. Just follow me on social media in general, and on Rumble as well, just in case I get banned out of here. Most of all, thanks to Keith for joining me, and thanks for staying on so long. I think we had a good conversation, so I appreciate it.
Good stuff. Thanks for having me on.
All right. See you, everybody.